October 12, 1943. A 20mm cannon shell tears through the engine of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 23,000 feet above the Rhineland, and black smoke explodes from the cowling like a volcanic eruption. The aircraft lurches violently. 9 men inside feel death reaching up through the aluminum floor. 140 miles from England. 2 engines already failing. 20 German fighters circling like wolves who smell blood in the water. By every calculation that existed, these men were already dead. The math was simple, brutal, and completely unforgiving. No escort, no support, no chance. And then, out of the chaos of that burning sky, a single P-47 Thunderbolt banked hard and made a decision that had absolutely no rational justification whatsoever. Its pilot, a 24-year-old farm boy from New Jersey named James Howell, who had spent his childhood fixing tractor engines and baling hay, chose to stay. What happened in the next 90 miles would redefine everything we think we know about courage, sacrifice, and what one man can decide to do when the entire universe is telling him to leave. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more incredible stories, historical events, and breathtaking moments from the past that will leave you speechless. Before we meet James Howell, you need to understand exactly how catastrophic the situation over occupied Europe had become by the autumn of 1943, because without that context, you cannot fully feel the weight of what he chose to do. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was bleeding the United States Army Air Forces at a rate that senior commanders were beginning to speak about only in whispers behind closed doors. The numbers were staggering, and they were getting worse every single week. During the infamous first Schweinfurt raid in August of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 in a single day. 600 men, gone. Not wounded, not captured, gone. And the ball-bearing factories they were sent to destroy were operational again within weeks. The second Schweinfurt raid, the one James Howell flew into on October 12th, would prove even more catastrophic. 320 B-17s crossed the English Channel that morning. The Luftwaffe launched over 400 fighters to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, rising from a dozen airfields across Germany, and occupied France in coordinated swarms that had been rehearsed and refined through months of brutal trial and error. The sky above central Germany became something that survivors would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. Bombers fell in spiraling flames, shedding wings and crew members, trailing debris across 50 miles of German sky. The escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts that had fought desperately to protect the formation through the morning hours, were forced to turn back at the German border when their fuel gauges touched critical levels. That was the brutal arithmetic of 1943 air war. The fighters that could protect the bombers could not fly far enough, and the bombers that flew far enough could not protect themselves. Men died because of the gap in range that engineers were racing to solve but hadn't solved yet. Into that gap, the Luftwaffe poured everything they had. The 100th Bomb Group Hayes's unit based at Thorpe Abbotts was already legendary among American aircrew for the worst possible reason. They were called the Bloody 100th. On some missions, they had taken losses so severe that other groups refused to fly formation with them, superstitiously convinced that the curse was somehow contagious. First Lieutenant Robert Hayes understood all of this when he climbed into the cockpit of his B-17 that October morning. His crew was flying their 19th mission. One more after this, and they would have reached the 20 required for rotation home. They were so close to survival that some of the men had started to believe they might actually make it. That belief is a dangerous thing at 23,000 feet over the Rhineland. The mission had gone wrong from the moment they reached the target. Flak burst beneath the aircraft during the bomb run, shrapnel punching through aluminum skin with the sound of gravel thrown against a tin roof. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Eddie Martinez, caught fragments in his left shoulder. The waist gunner, Corporal Tommy Briggs, was knocked unconscious when a chunk of steel dented his helmet so severely that the metal pressed against his skull somehow without penetrating it. Then the fighters came. 4. Focke-Wulf 190s dove from the 11 o'clock position. their wings sparkling with cannon fire, and one of those cannon shells found the number 3 engine of Hayes's aircraft at the worst possible moment. The propeller began windmilling. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The nose dropped 15 degrees, and Hayes felt the control yoke shudder in his hands like something alive and dying. In the radio room, Sergeant Mike Donnelly watched hydraulic fluid spray across the fuselage wall in a pattern that looked disturbingly like an arterial bleed. The Fortress was injured in every system that mattered, and the formation pressed on without them, because that was standard procedure, and everyone on that aircraft understood it. You do not compromise 300 aircraft and 3,000 men for one crew. That is not callousness. That is the arithmetic of war, and every man in a bomber group had made peace with it before they ever left England. James Howell was 24 years old, and he had grown up on a farm outside Flemington, New Jersey, in the kind of rural American landscape that teaches you things about mechanical systems and physical endurance that no classroom ever could. He had learned to drive a tractor at 9. He had rebuilt a car engine at 15. He had spent long adolescent summers doing work that broke older men, hauling bales and fixing equipment that was always breaking down in ways that required improvisation rather than instruction manuals. When the war came, the Army Air Forces found in him something they desperately needed: a man who could think clearly under pressure, adapt to equipment that was failing, and make rapid decisions with incomplete information. He had logged 312 combat hours over Europe by October 1943. He had flown 72 missions. He had seen things that he would carry inside him for the rest of his life without ever finding adequate words for them. He flew a P-47 Thunderbolt called Jersey Thunder, and he had stenciled that name below the cockpit himself with careful brushstrokes, the way a man marks something he cares about. When he saw Hayes's B-17 take the hit and begin to fall away from the formation, something happened inside Howell that he would later be almost completely unable to articulate. He banked hard and followed. He keyed his radio and told Hayes he had him visual and was not going anywhere, and that was a promise he had no authorization to make and no rational basis for keeping given what his fuel gauge was already telling him. 58 minutes of fuel remaining. The bomber was crawling at 140 knots. England was 90 miles northwest. The math didn't favor anyone in that sky, and Howell knew it as clearly as he knew his own name. He stayed anyway. That single decision made in perhaps 3 seconds of radio silence would require him to fight the most sustained and furious individual air battle of the entire European campaign. The first German attack came from the south. 3 Bf-109s in splinter camouflage, their pilots moving with the predatory confidence of men who understood that a straggler without escorts was essentially defenseless. Howell positioned his Thunderbolt between the fighters and the bomber and advanced his throttle. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, and it needed every single one of them now. He closed to 400 yards on the lead Messerschmitt and pressed the trigger. All 8 50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The recoil was physically perceptible, slowing the aircraft for a fraction of a second, and tracers converged on the German fighter's fuselage with devastating accuracy. The canopy shattered. Glycol coolant sprayed from the radiator in white streams. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and fell away trailing smoke, and the other 2 German fighters scattered and climbed for altitude, suddenly uncertain about an opponent who had just demonstrated that confidence is sometimes more dangerous than numerical advantage. But there were more coming. There were always more coming. 5. Bf-109s appeared at 12 o'clock level, a Vic formation approaching head-on with the kind of coordinated precision that meant someone on the German side had radioed ahead and organized a hunting party specifically for this crippled bomber. Howell flew directly at them. This was not courage in the conventional sense. This was calculated disruption. A head-on pass at a combined closing speed of over 500 knots gives nobody involved enough time to aim properly, and the psychological pressure of watching a fighter come straight at your formation tends to produce exactly the kind of flinching and braking that Howell needed. The lead German broke right. The formation collapsed into chaos. Howell dove under the disorganized mass of aircraft rolled inverted and came up firing at the trailing 109. More hits. The German aircraft streamed smoke from its engine and banked sharply away. Two more of the Messerschmitts looped around and tried to attack the bomber from the rear, and Hayes's tail gunner Sergeant Walt Kendrick managed 4 rounds from his twin .50 calibers before both guns jammed simultaneously. Howell saw it happen. He pulled through a high G-turn that grayed his vision at the edges and closed to 600 yards on the nearest attacker and fired until the Messerschmitt's wing folded upward, torn free by aerodynamic forces, and the aircraft tumbled end over end into the cloud deck below. The remaining Germans broke off and fled eastward. 3 aircraft lost or damaged in 5 minutes. The arithmetic had shifted momentarily in their favor, but Howell's fuel gauge now showed 28 minutes. The channel was 65 miles away. The bomber was descending through 16,000 feet with no sign of stabilizing, and Morrison had already told Hayes quietly that the numbers didn't support a successful landing on English soil. Howell leaned his fuel mixture to absolute maximum economy, adjusted his propeller pitch, pulled back to minimum cruise power, and tried to buy minutes with every technique he had ever learned about fuel management. Maybe 2 more minutes, maybe 3. The difference between surviving and not surviving in that sky was measured in minutes and gallons, and the willingness of one man to stay when every calculation was telling him to leave. 6 more fighters appeared at 10 o'clock high. Then Howell's ammunition was nearly gone. Then the number 2 engine on the bomber caught fire and died. Then 2 engines gone out of 4 meant the aircraft was descending at 300 feet per minute toward cold gray water, and nobody was going to make the coast. Howell's engine coughed once, twice, and quit. The silence was absolute and shocking, and completely finally clear about what was going to happen next. He pushed the nose down to maintain airspeed, and began his approach to a water landing in the English Channel in October alongside the bomber he had protected for 90 miles of burning sky, because he had decided at the beginning that they were going home together or not at all. The water came up fast and cold and unforgiving. In Part 2, we will follow James Howell and the crew of that B-17 into the freezing water of the English Channel, where survival time was measured in minutes, where 9 men clung to life rafts in moderate seas, with one of them already gone, and where the decision Howell made over Germany would be tested one final time by the most indifferent judge of all. They were in the water. 9 men clinging to 2 orange life rafts in the English Channel in October, with water temperature at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and survival time measured in approximately 20 minutes, before hypothermia shut down every system in the human body one by one. James Howell had just surfaced from a cockpit filling with seawater, fought free of 8 tons of sinking aircraft with numb hands and 0 visibility, and pulled himself onto a raft that was already crowded with men who had survived something that should not have been survivable. One man had not made it. Sergeant Eddie Martinez, trapped in the collapsed ball turret on impact, was gone. And somewhere on the other raft, Robert Hayes was counting heads and doing the math that every commander dreads, the math where the number you get is smaller than the number you started with. But what happened in the 18 minutes before the RAF rescue launch arrived, and what happened in the 3 days after, would trigger a controversy inside the United States Army Air Forces that nobody who flew combat missions over Europe in 1943 had any appetite for, because it asked a question that senior commanders absolutely did not want answered. The question was this: if one P-47 pilot with 58 minutes of fuel could protect a crippled bomber for 90 miles and destroy or drive off more than a dozen enemy fighters in the process, why were bombers being sent to Schweinfurt and Regensburg and Münster with no escort at all beyond the German border? Colonel Harrison Webb received James Howell's mission report 3 days after the ditching in an office at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe that smelled of pipe tobacco and institutional carpet. Webb was 51 years old, a career officer who had spent the interwar years flying observation aircraft over Central America and developing theories about strategic bombardment that he had never been required to test against actual opposition. He read Howell's report twice, set it down on his desk, and looked at the young lieutenant standing at attention across from him, with the Distinguished Service Cross still fresh on his chest, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You violated protocol, Lieutenant. You abandoned your assigned patrol sector. You expended your aircraft's fuel in a manner that resulted in its total loss. And you are here filing a report that essentially argues the entire escort doctrine of this command is incorrect. Howell stood very still. Yes, sir, that is what the report says. Webb leaned back. Every pilot in this command would like to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. Every single one of them. Do you understand why we cannot simply do that? Howell said. With respect, sir, I did it. The fuel allowed it if you manage the throttle setting correctly. I was running on fumes, but I made the coast alongside them. Webb closed the folder. This conversation is over. Lieutenant, return to your unit. A formal review of this incident will determine whether disciplinary action is warranted. Howell left the office, and the folder went into a drawer, and 37 more B-17s were shot down over Germany in the following 2 weeks. But Webb had made a mistake. He had allowed a junior intelligence officer named Captain Daniel Ferris to sit in the corner of that office and take notes, and Ferris was not a career officer with institutional loyalty to existing doctrine. Ferris was a 30-year-old former aeronautical engineer from Dayton, Ohio, who had spent 2 years before the war calculating fuel consumption curves for Pratt & Whitney, and who had read Howell's report with the specific attention of a man who understood exactly what the numbers meant. That evening, Ferris found Howell in the officers' mess and sat down across from him without asking permission and said, "Your fuel management data in that report. Walk me through it." They talked for 4 hours. Ferris covered 3 pages of a yellow legal pad with calculations. At the end of it, he looked up and said, "You're not wrong. If you strip the external tanks, lean the mixture to 70%, and fly at 15,000 instead of 25, you can extend the combat radius of a P-47 by roughly 60 miles. 60 miles gets you past the German border. Past the German border changes everything about this war." Howell stared at him. "Can you prove that to someone who matters?" Ferris tapped his pen against the legal pad. "I can prove it to anyone who will sit still long enough to look at the arithmetic. The problem is finding someone with enough rank to authorize a formal test and enough intelligence to understand what they're looking at." He paused. "I might know someone." Brigadier General Marcus Aldridge had commanded a fighter group in the Pacific before a mechanical failure had grounded him indefinitely with a knee that radar could detect, but surgeons could not repair. He was 44, ambitious, frustrated by desk work, and possessed of the specific intellectual flexibility that comes from having been proven wrong about something important early enough in a career to learn from it. Ferris had written 3 analysis memos for Aldridge in the previous 6 months, and all 3 had been acted on. When Ferris laid the fuel consumption data in front of him on a Tuesday morning in November 1943, Aldridge read it in silence, asked 2 technical questions, and then said, "You want a formal test?" Ferris said, "I want a formal test with official witnesses, documented fuel states at every checkpoint, and a result that goes up the chain with Aldridge's name on it, rather than a junior lieutenant's." Aldridge almost smiled. 1 flight, 1 documented attempt. If the numbers don't hold, this goes nowhere, and we never discuss it again. Ferris said, "The numbers will hold." Aldridge said, "They had better, because if they don't, I have just destroyed both our careers and done nothing for the men dying over Germany." The test took place on a clear Thursday morning, November 18, 1943, at an airfield in Suffolk. 12 senior officers stood beside a operations tent with coffee cups and the particular expression of men who expect to be confirming what they already believe. Howell flew the test aircraft. Ferris stood at a fuel monitoring station with a stopwatch and a clipboard. The parameters were exact, a simulated escort mission profile extending to the German border and back, with fuel state documented at 15-minute intervals, throttle settings recorded continuously, and 3 independent observers calculating the numbers in real time. At the 2-hour mark, when standard doctrine said the P-47 should be at bingo fuel and turning for home, Howell's aircraft had 31 minutes remaining. At 2 hours and 20 minutes, when he would have crossed the German border on a real mission, he had 19 minutes. At 2 hours and 40 minutes, when he would have reached the outer approaches to Schweinfurt, he had 9 minutes. Enough to engage, enough to fight, not enough to stay, but enough to make the difference between a formation that arrives defended and a formation that arrives naked. One of the observing colonels put down his coffee cup. Another one walked to the fuel monitoring table and looked at Ferris's numbers without speaking for approximately 30 seconds. A third officer, who had argued most vocally before the test that the entire exercise was a waste of time and aviation fuel, turned to the man standing next to him and said nothing at all, which was itself a form of answer. Aldridge watched all of this from 20 feet away and did not permit himself any visible expression of satisfaction, because that was not how you moved things through a military bureaucracy. You let the numbers speak, and you let the men who had doubted feel that they had arrived at the conclusion themselves. When Howell landed and taxied to the fuel truck and the ground crew documented his remaining fuel state, Aldridge walked to the center of the group and said, "Gentlemen, the arithmetic has been demonstrated. The question before this command is whether we intend to act on it." The test had extended the documented combat radius by 58 miles compared to standard doctrine. 58 miles meant the German border. The German border meant the Schweinfurt route could be flown with fighter escort for the most dangerous portion of the approach. The comparison was not abstract. On the first Schweinfurt raid with no escort past the border, 60 bombers lost. The projection with extended escort coverage on the approach was losses reduced by an estimated 40%. 40%. That was not a tactical improvement. That was a different war. The resistance that followed was not loud. It was quiet and institutional, and far more dangerous than outright opposition because it operated through paperwork and scheduling, and the gentle prioritization of other matters. 3 units that received modified fuel management protocols in December 1943 reported that pilots had not been briefed adequately. 2 requests for additional P-47s to cover the extended patrol sectors were delayed by logistics reviews that took 6 weeks each. A formal memo from Webb's office noted that the test conditions had not replicated actual combat variables with sufficient fidelity to justify immediate doctrine change. Howell spent those weeks flying combat missions and watching the bureaucracy work against the thing he had proven with his own fuel gauge over the English Channel. But Aldridge was patient, and Ferris was relentless, and the losses over Germany continued accumulating in numbers that made the argument for them every single week without requiring any additional demonstration. By late January 1944, the first officially modified escort protocols reached 3 fighter groups. The first missions flown under the new parameters produced results that matched Ferris's projections within 4 percentage points. Bomber crews noticed something they had not experienced before. Friendly fighters still present when the Messerschmitts appeared over the German border. The psychological effect alone was measurable in ways that no memo had anticipated. Men who expected to be abandoned flew differently than men who expected to be protected. But on February 3, 1944, an RAF intelligence report arrived at 8th Air Force Headquarters that changed the nature of the problem entirely. German signals intelligence had detected the pattern of the new escort approach times. They had adjusted their interception tactics to concentrate force in the gap that still existed beyond the extended coverage zone. And the report contained one additional detail that nobody in the room was prepared for. 3. Focke-Wulf 190s had been modified with additional fuel capacity and were operating as long-range hunter-killers, specifically targeting the escort fighters at their furthest point of fuel extension, the moment when a P-47 was most vulnerable and least able to fight. Someone in the Luftwaffe had read the same arithmetic that Ferris had written on that yellow legal pad in November, and they had built an answer to it. The war that Howell had changed was changing again. And in Part 3, we will follow what happened when the hunter became the hunted, and when the solution to that problem required a decision even more difficult than the one James Howell made over the Rhineland on October 12, 1943. James Howell had proven that a P-47 could escort bombers past the German border. Daniel Ferris had proven the arithmetic was sound. Aldridge had forced the doctrine change through a bureaucracy that didn't want to change. And for 6 weeks in early 1944, The modified escort protocols were producing exactly the results that Ferris's calculations had predicted, with bomber loss rates on extended missions dropping by an estimated 38% compared to the previous autumn. But on February 3rd, an RAF intelligence report had revealed something that changed the entire nature of the problem. The Luftwaffe had read the same arithmetic. They had built an answer to it. And now the question was no longer whether the new doctrine worked. The question was whether it could survive contact with an enemy that had specifically designed a response to destroy it. The intelligence that arrived in February was not vague. It was precise, and it was alarming. German signals analysis units had tracked the timing patterns of the new escort approach protocols across 11 missions and had identified with accuracy the specific fuel state windows during which P-47s were most constrained in their ability to maneuver and fight. A modified Focke-Wulf 190 variant, carrying an additional 80 liters of fuel in a ventral tank that reduced its performance by 11%, but extended its combat radius by 65 miles, had been deployed to 3 Jagdgeschwader units, specifically targeting the escort fighters at their furthest extension point. The Luftwaffe called the tactic Schwarmjagd auf Begleiter, hunter packs against escorts. Between February 7th and February 19th, 1944, 8 P-47s were lost to this tactic in circumstances that shared an identical signature, engaged at maximum range fuel states too low for sustained maneuvering combat, forced to disengage or destroyed before they could protect the bombers they were covering. On the February 19th mission to Brunswick, 3 escorts were destroyed in 4 minutes by a coordinated pack of 6 modified FW-190Is that had specifically waited for the fuel state window. The bombers those 3 P-47s had been covering lost 9 aircraft in the subsequent unprotected minutes. The Germans had not just adapted, they had engineered a counter. The war had escalated to a new level of sophistication, and the men paying the price for that escalation were dying over Germany, while the response was still being debated at High Wycombe. The internal pressure that followed was immediate, and it landed directly on Howell and Ferris. Webb's office produced a memo within 72 hours of the Brunswick losses, noting that the modified escort doctrine had now demonstrably contributed to the deaths of American fighter pilots through the creation of a predictable vulnerability pattern. The language was careful and bureaucratic and completely devastating in its implication. Ferris read it twice and then walked to Aldridge's office and put it on his desk without speaking. Aldridge read it and said, "They're not wrong about the vulnerability. They're wrong about the conclusion." Ferris said, "The conclusion they'll draw is that we revert to the old parameters." Aldridge said nothing for a moment. Then, "If we revert, we lose the 38% improvement in bomber survival. We trade pilot lives for bomber lives and call it doctrine." The arithmetic was brutal in both directions. Howell, when he heard about the memo through the informal network of junior officers who always knew everything before it was official, said only one thing. The answer isn't to pull back the escorts. The answer is to give the escorts more fuel. He was right. He was also a lieutenant, and his opinion carried exactly the institutional weight that rank implied. But the idea he had stated in one sentence would take 6 weeks, 2 engineering teams, and a direct intervention from a visiting American general to actually implement. In the meantime, men continued dying in the specific window that Ferris's doctrine had inadvertently created, and every loss added weight to the argument of the people who wanted to undo everything that Howell had started. February 24th, 1944. The target was Schweinfurt again, the same ball-bearing factories that had cost 60 bombers and 600 men in October. The mission planners knew the Luftwaffe would be waiting in force. They knew the modified FW-190s would be hunting escorts at the fuel state window. And they chose to fly the mission anyway because the ball-bearing factories were still producing, and the strategic logic that had sent men to die over Schweinfurt in October had not changed. 266 B-17s assembled over England in the pre-dawn darkness. 32 P-47 groups were assigned escort duties under the revised doctrine, with Howell's group covering the approach corridor from the Belgian border to a point 40 miles inside Germany. The weather over the Channel was clear. Over Germany, it was broken cloud at 18,000 feet, which meant the bomber formation was visible from above against a white ceiling, and the escort fighters were silhouetted from below against open sky. Not ideal, not remotely ideal, but the mission was going. Howell led his flight of 8 P-47s at 22,000 feet, positioned above and behind the lead bomber box. His fuel gauge showed full. His ammunition load was complete. His throttle was set to the modified economy profile that Ferris had calculated, the one that bought 60 additional miles of range at the cost of 10% of top speed. The first German fighters appeared at the German border exactly as intelligence had predicted. Not the modified FW-190H as yet. These were standard Bf-109s in the high cover role, probing the formation, testing the escort response, reporting back on positioning and fuel states. Howell recognized the tactic immediately. They're counting our minutes. They're timing us. He keyed the radio. All Jersey flights maintain position. Do not pursue individual contacts. They want to draw us out of fuel state. 2 of his pilots acknowledged. One didn't, banking hard after a 109 that had made a close pass on the lead bomber. Howell watched the pursuit develop and said nothing, because the pursuit was tactically correct if you didn't understand what was happening at a higher level of the engagement. The 109 the pilot was chasing was bait. The trap was the fuel gauge. Then the modified FW-190Hs came. 6 of them. From below and to the right, climbing steeply into the escort layer at the precise moment that Standard Doctrine said 3 of the 8 P-47s should be at minimum fuel for maneuvering combat. They hit fast, and they hit hard. The lead FW-190 opened fire at 800 yards. Strikes on the nearest P-47. The aircraft shuddered, trailed white coolant, and began descending. The pack split into 2 elements of 3, one continuing on the escort layer, one angling down toward the now partially unprotected bomber formation. This was the moment. This was what the intelligence report had described and what nobody had found a clean answer to. Howell shoved the throttle forward. Full military power. Fuel economy was done. He rolled inverted dove through 2,000 feet and came up inside the turning radius of the lead FW-190 before the German pilot had completed his pass on the bombers. The angle was extreme. The deflection calculation was the kind that most pilots would not have attempted. Howell fired. 2 seconds of continuous fire. 40 rounds from 8 guns converging on the Focke-Wulf's wing root at 350 yards. The wing separated. The aircraft inverted instantly and fell away spinning. 2. 3. Howell climbing back to altitude, already tracking the next target. The second element of FW-190Hs had broken off when they saw the lead fighter destroyed. They had expected a constrained, fuel-cautious response. They had expected the window to be open. It wasn't open. Howell had simply decided to spend the fuel and fight. 4 more P-47s from the trailing flight reached the engagement 30 seconds later. The German pack now facing 8 functional escorts where they had expected 3 constrained ones disengaged and dove for cloud cover. The bombers pressed on to Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing factories were hit. Hard. 63% of the primary structures in the assessed target complex were damaged or destroyed in the strike assessment completed 48 hours after the mission. 28 bombers were lost. A devastating number. But the first Schweinfurt raid had lost 60. The second had lost 60. This raid lost 28, with a targeting result that exceeded both previous missions by every measurable metric. The escort doctrine had held. The Luftwaffe's counter had been broken in 30 seconds by a pilot who decided the fuel was worth spending. The morning after, Schweinfurt Ferris updated his comparative analysis with the new numbers and brought it to Aldridge's office. February 24th mission. 28 bombers lost versus an estimated 52 under standard October Doctrine parameters. Escort fuel expenditure above planned profile 31%. German fighters engaged by escorts 47. German fighters destroyed or damaged by escorts 19. The modified FW-190 pack lost 3 of 6 aircraft on first engagement and did not attempt a second. The analysis went up the chain with Aldridge's signature, and Webb's signature added beneath it, which was the first time Webb had put his name on anything connected to the extended escort doctrine, and everyone who understood how military bureaucracies operate understood exactly what that meant. The doctrine was no longer experimental. It was no longer Howell's idea or Ferris's arithmetic. It was official United States Army Air Force's strategic bombing escort policy, effective immediately across all 8th Air Force fighter groups. Within 3 weeks, the modified fuel management protocols had been distributed to 41 P-47 and P-51 groups operating from English bases. The P-51 Mustang, with its superior range characteristics and the same modified throttle protocols, began covering bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back in March 1944. All the way to Berlin. The strategic calculus of the entire European air war shifted in the space of 6 weeks. German fighter production was redirected toward interceptors rather than ground support aircraft, a resource commitment that degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness at Normandy in June by an amount that historians would argue about for decades. Bomber crew survival rates improved by 44% between October 1943 and June 1944, a number that represented thousands of men who went home instead of going into the ground over Germany. The Luftwaffe flew 240 fewer effective sorties per month against the bomber formations than they had in the autumn of 1943, because the calculation that had made escort hunting profitable was broken, and the new calculation no longer favored the attack. James Howell received a promotion to captain in March 1944. Ferris received a commendation that used careful language to credit his analytical work without mentioning the 6 weeks during which that work had been buried in Webb's drawer. Aldridge received a second star in April. None of them were mentioned in the press releases that announced the new escort doctrine. That was not how these things worked, and none of them expected otherwise. Howell flew his 100th mission in April 1944. He was 25 years old. He had now protected bomber formations across more than 12,000 miles of cumulative escort track over occupied Europe. He did not speak at the small ceremony his group held for the occasion. He shook hands, accepted the offered drink, and went to bed early, because there was another mission the next morning. That was the entire ceremony. That was the whole of it. And after the war, when writers and historians began assembling the record of what had changed the strategic bombing campaign, James Howell's name appeared in footnotes and secondary citations, and the kind of institutional documentation that requires deliberate searching to find. The decision he made over the Rhineland on October 12, 1943, and everything that followed from it, had altered the trajectory of the war over Europe in ways that can be measured in the thousands of men who survived missions they would not have survived under the doctrine that existed before that afternoon. But the man himself remained almost entirely invisible to history, and in Part 4 we will ask why. We will follow Howell back to New Jersey into the silence he chose and kept for 55 years, and into the single conversation he had in 1998 that finally put his name where it had always belonged. The last chapter of this story is not about the war. It never was. From a farm boy from New Jersey who stayed with a dying bomber when every calculation said leave to a doctrine change that altered the entire strategic air campaign over Europe. James Howell had protected 9 men across 90 miles of burning sky, survived a channel ditching in October water, and then watched his fuel management data become the foundation of a policy that would reshape how bomber escorts operated for the remainder of the war. Parts 1 through 3 of this story followed the arc from that single decision over the Rhineland to the February 24th Schweinfurt mission that broke the Luftwaffe's counter-tactic and proved the doctrine was sound. But there is a question that this story has been circling from the beginning without answering directly. What happened to James Howell when the war ended? What happened to the man who started all of this? Because the answer to that question is the most important part of the entire story, and almost nobody knows it. Howell flew his final combat mission on April 28, 1944. He returned to England, filed his last mission report, shook the hands that needed to be shaken, and boarded a transport for the United States in June of that year. After the Normandy landings had confirmed that the strategic air campaign had accomplished its primary objective of degrading Luftwaffe capability to respond effectively to a ground invasion. He arrived in New York Harbor on a gray Tuesday morning and took a train to New Jersey, and that was essentially the end of his public story for 54 years. He did not write a memoir. He did not speak to journalists. When veterans organizations contacted him in the 1950s and 1960s for accounts of the October 12th mission or the escort doctrine development, he replied with brief letters that acknowledged the events and declined to elaborate. He went back to farming. He married a woman named Catherine Broussard in 1947. They had 3 children. He repaired tractor engines and baled hay and drove into town on Saturdays. And the people of Flemington, New Jersey, knew him as a quiet man who had served and come home, which described approximately 1 in 10 men of his generation, and did not distinguish him in any way that the town found remarkable. The Distinguished Service Cross sat in a wooden box in a bureau drawer. His children knew it was there. They did not know the full story of why. Howell never told them, not because the memory was painful, though it was, but because he had a specific and considered view about what the story meant and who it belonged to. He believed it belonged to Eddie Martinez, who had not come home from that ball turret. He believed it belonged to the 800 and something men whose bomber missions over Germany had been made survivable by a doctrine change that had his fingerprints on it, but not his name on the official record. He believed that a man who had done what he did because it was the right thing to do had no particular claim to tell the story of having done it. That was his position, and he held it for 5 decades, with the same stubborn consistency that had kept him flying alongside a burning bomber when his fuel gauge was reading critical. The technical legacy of what Howell and Ferris had demonstrated did not disappear with the end of the war. The modified fuel management protocols developed in November and December 1943 became foundational doctrine for United States Air Force escort operations in Korea, where F-86 Sabres flying extended patrol profiles over MiG Alley used throttle management techniques derived directly from the 1943 8th Air Force parameters. The principle that a fighter's effective combat radius is a variable determined by pilot technique rather than a fixed number determined by tank capacity became a standard element of advanced fighter training curriculum by 1952. During the Vietnam conflict, F-4 Phantom crews operating escort and combat air patrol missions over North Vietnam were trained on fuel management techniques whose lineage ran directly back to Ferris's yellow legal pad calculations. The specific numbers changed. The aircraft changed. The principle did not. Across 3 major conflicts following World War II, an estimated methodology derived from the 1943 extended escort protocols was in use by American fighter pilots on approximately 40,000 combat sorties. The aggregate effect of improved bomber and strike aircraft survivability attributable to extended escort coverage across those 3 conflicts represents a number that military historians have never fully calculated because the counterfactual, what would have happened under the old doctrine, is by definition impossible to measure with precision. But the directional conclusion is not seriously disputed. Ferris wrote in a 1987 letter to a military history journal that he estimated the combined effect of the doctrine change from its adoption in early 1944 through the end of the European campaign had contributed to the survival of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 American airmen who would otherwise have been lost on missions where extended escort coverage was the variable that mattered. 4,000 to 6,000 men. Because one pilot decided to stay and then could not stop thinking about why the math should have let him do it. The lesson that emerges from James Howell's story is not primarily a lesson about aviation or fuel management or even military doctrine. It is a lesson about the specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with being correct about something that the institution around you insists is wrong. Physical courage, the kind Howell demonstrated on October 12th over the Rhineland, is relatively straightforward in the sense that the stakes are clear and the choice is immediate. Intellectual courage, the kind that Ferris demonstrated when he put 3 pages of arithmetic in front of a brigadier general and said the established doctrine is incorrect, And here is why operates in a more complex environment where the resistance is polite and bureaucratic and completely capable of burying a correct idea indefinitely without ever being obviously wrong. The history of military innovation is filled with ideas that were correct and ignored sometimes until the human cost of ignoring them became impossible to defend. The proximity fuse, the cavity magnetron, the Jeep, the use of penicillin in field hospitals, the application of convoy tactics to Atlantic shipping after German submarines were inflicting losses that should have prompted the change 18 months earlier than it occurred. In every case, the pattern is similar. A person or small group identifies a solution. The institution resists. The resistance is not malicious, but it is powerful because institutions are built to preserve what has worked rather than to discover what might work better. The individuals who push through that resistance successfully share certain characteristics. They have data rather than intuition. They find allies with rank rather than trying to win arguments with logic alone. They are patient enough to survive the bureaucratic delay without becoming the kind of persistent irritant that gets transferred rather than heard. Howell and Ferris and Aldridge, operating together as an informal coalition across 6 weeks in late 1943, demonstrated all of these characteristics. The lesson applies today with identical force in any organization that faces the choice between the doctrine that has worked and the idea that might work better. Here is the detail that almost nobody knows. In 1998, a military historian named Professor Gerald Marsh at the University of Maryland was completing a comprehensive study of 8th Air Force escort doctrine development for a volume on the strategic bombing campaign. His research required access to operational records from the 100th Bomb Group and the fighter groups that had participated in the October and November 1943 missions, and in those records, he found Ferris's original 3-page calculation from the evening of October 13, 1943. The night he sat down with Howell in the officers' mess and covered a legal pad with fuel consumption numbers. The document had been filed as an attachment to a routine intelligence summary and had sat in the National Archives for 55 years without being specifically identified or cited in any of the existing historical literature on the doctrine change. Marsh tracked down Howell, who was 80 years old and still living in Flemington, and drove to New Jersey to interview him. The conversation lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Marsh asked Howell whether he had known that his fuel management observations from the October 12th mission had been the direct catalyst for everything that followed the test. The doctrine change, the Korea applications. The estimated thousands of men who survived missions under extended escort coverage. Howell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew what I did over the channel. I didn't know about the rest of it." He died 6 months later in December 1998. The Christmas cards from the families of the men he had saved arrived that year as they had every year. Catherine Howell collected them in the wooden box that had held the Distinguished Service Cross, which is where they remained when she donated the entire collection to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in 2003. From a farm boy from New Jersey with a fuel gauge and a decision he made in 3 seconds of radio silence to a doctrine change that improved bomber survival rates by 44% and contributed to the survival of an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 American airmen across the remainder of the European campaign, and 2 subsequent conflicts, James Howell proved that the most important thing a person can do in a moment of crisis is not always the most dramatic thing, and that the decision to stay, to not leave, to not abandon the arithmetic even when it is inconvenient, is sometimes the decision that changes everything. He spent 54 years believing the story belonged to the men who hadn't come home, and to the men who had survived because of work he never took credit for. He was correct that the story belonged to them, but it also belonged to him, and now you know it. If this story reached you the way it reached us when we first found it in those 1998 interview transcripts, share it with someone who needs to hear that the most powerful thing any person can do is simply refuse to leave. When leaving would be easier. Subscribe and stay with us, because next time we're going to a Pacific island where a decision equally impossible and equally human changed a different war in a different sky. The measure of a person is not what they do when success is guaranteed. It is what they do when the fuel gauge is in the red and England is still 90 miles away, and 9 men are counting on a promise that nobody authorized them to make.